students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 4, Ecosystem Dynamics. This is video number 18 and we're going to have a very quick tour around climate change. In this particular video, we're going to try and see if we can investigate changes in past ecosystems that may inform our approach to the management of future ecosystems, specifically looking at the role of changing climate on ecosystems. Now, this isn't new for us. We've had a number of looks at some of the particularly mass extinction events in the past and the role that climate might have played, or at least the contribution that climate change may have made to exacerbating or bringing on some of those previous mass extinction events. It's definitely the case that we can see changes in climate and the impact that those changes have had on the Australian environment and the Australian biota. Specifically, we've talked about the Gondwanan southern continent, the supercontinent that included Australia, Antarctica, South America, and Africa. And that as that continent broke apart and Australia drifted northwards, we saw some significant changes in the climate. And one of the consequences of those changes in climate was changes in the Australian biota. And it means we've had an opportunity to investigate some of the changes that climate can have on the biodiversity of a particular region. Most recent changes in climate have contributed to a drying out and a general warming of the continent, and the consequence of that has been a contraction of the rainforests and wet sclerophyll forests to the north and also to the coastal margins. This means that sclerophyll forests and grasslands have dominated, and a very large portion of the interior of Australia is desert. This has also resulted in a loss of a rich food supply, which has affected a lot of the larger herbivores in particular, and so this is a contributor to why we think a lot of the megabeasts, a lot of the Australian megafauna have subsequently died out. Now, there's an oversimplification that occurs here because the changes in ecosystems are often more complex than simply some elements disappearing. So we know that there was a lot of things happening. But one of the important things to keep in mind, and I've mentioned it fairly often through this series of videos, is the rate of change. So we know that change is always going to happen, but what we're interested in is the rate of change. What's been referred to as the Great Drying in Australia has really had quite a significant effect on the Australian biota, and we've seen a lot of different plants and animals show adaptations to a much drier climate, which is what we have now. Some of the regions which were previously moist and temperate are now dry and hot. And as I said before, especially in the centre of the continent, the Simpson Desert dominates that arid part of central Australia. And Australia's desert dwellers have had to adapt to the changing conditions. And so we've seen a number of different adaptations, particularly to conserving water and regulating temperature amongst both the flora and the fauna of Australia. We've talked about some of these adaptations, and of course, we also look at adaptations as part of Module 3. So one of the things that we need to be able to do is we need to take what we've learnt from past environments and past experiences, or what the fossil record is revealing to us, or what the information from geological structures, the rocks, are telling us, and how we might apply that in the future. Climate change is a change in the pattern of the weather and related changes in oceans, in land surfaces and ice sheets. So there's a number of different components when we talk about climate change. It's also definitely the case that changes have occurred in the past, and in fact we've seen cycles between greenhouse conditions and icehouse conditions, times of great warming and times of great cooling. If it's true that the climate does change in a cyclic way, that does go through periods of warming and periods of cooling, that some of the areas of evidence that we looked at in terms of, say, ice cores, some of the evidence from the geology, from the rocks, even things like the distribution of oxygen isotopes, if all of these things are telling us something about the cyclic nature of climate change, why does it worry us that that climate change is a significant issue for us now in 2023? Well, it's the rate. It's simply the rate of change and the magnitude of the changes that are occurring are much greater on a greater scale and at a faster rate than they have ever been in the past. So when we project this into the future, and that's what this section's about, learning from the past and projecting into the future, what effect this might have on the Earth's biodiversity, we need to think about how climate change has impacted on ecosystems in the past and whether the changes that are occurring now are going to have similar sorts of impacts into the future. The problem that we have is in any population, we have identified the fact that populations are able to shift through a process of microevolution and based on things like specific selecting agents. And it is absolutely the case that climate can be a selecting agent. If it starts to get cooler, it starts to get warmer, it starts to get wetter or drier, these are significant factors which may well preferentially select certain individuals in populations to be better adapted to those changes. The problem is if the rate of change is so fast, the effect that it can have on populations can be so significant that the population numbers can drop dramatically, falling to levels which can be at or at least close to extinction. And the problem is, even if a species doesn't become extinct, but its numbers become critically endangered, then other potential issues can arise. Firstly, significant reduction in the gene pool. Secondly, perhaps an increase in inbreeding, which is going to create other problems associated, genetic problems associated with closely breeding individuals. And that's one of the consequences of having very small populations, is that it's much higher likelihood that the surviving individuals are going to be even fairly closely related to one another. Now, I guess if we're going to have anything useful to say about climate change, then probably one of the things we do want to do is look at a little bit of data. The biggest problem here is that we can use all sorts of different data to say all sorts of different things, and this particular area of science is very widely studied and definitely can't be covered in a small video. So I encourage you to have a look at as many things as you possibly can. I've suggested some other resources in the past. I think Tim Flannery writes in a particularly accessible way. I've mentioned Dr. Karl's books as well. And I think that they provide a nice overview of the science that's associated with climate change. But the CSIRO, a very important scientific organisation here in Australia, and this is one of the graphs that was produced as part of their State of the Climate 2022 report. Now, there's some important things to notice about this. Firstly, is it true that there has been fluctuations in these temperature anomalies, cooler and warmer, over the last 100 or so years? Yes, it is. You can see that there are highs and lows occurring all over the place as these temperatures fluctuate. But I think it is also, or at least to my eye, it's also looking like a curve that has an upward trajectory. Now, that upward trajectory is the concern, because we're only looking at 100 years. Now, geologically speaking, this is no time at all. This is a very, very short period of time, a blink in geological history, something that wouldn't even be recorded in the fossil record or in the rocks. So this is our problem. Both the Australian surface air temperatures and the sea surface temperatures, that's the blue graph, so these ones too have gone through highs and lows, but again, there's a general upward trend. Now, do these general upward trends concern us? Well, they do concern me. You may feel that the scale of this isn't high, but as I said, the problem for me is the time frame over which this is happening. And this is a short time frame, and these are some quite significant values that we're seeing. Remember too, that when we talk about average changes, we're talking about averages over a very large area. And we're also talking about the fact that an average increase of 1 degree doesn't mean every single place on the Earth increases by 1 degree. You get some areas in which the change is higher and some in which the change is lower. A class could have their general marks improved by giving every single person in the class 1 extra mark. That would raise the average by 1. If you've got a class of 20 students, you could also give one person 20 marks. That would still raise the average by 1%, but the effect would be very, very different. And this is one of the things that we need to look at when we're studying patterns when we're studying data and we're trying to make conclusions. The frequency and severity of some significant climate events, and here I'm talking about things like storms, cyclones, floods, droughts. And I'm not just talking about Australia here. I'm seeing some of these around the world. Fire, bushfires. All of these things are concerning not only with the increased frequency of each of these events, but also in their severity. And the two things combined together suggest that climate change is a significant issue. And because we know that climate in the past has had at least some, if not a significant impact on biodiversity, this alone would be a concern. The climate change is going to do something to our biodiversity. And yet when you combine this with many of the other human activities, such as land clearing, deforestation, monocultures for agriculture, addition of pesticides and herbicides that can find their way into water supplies, all of these added together are suggesting some very serious consequences for future biodiversity. We're going to have a look at two final areas in which we might be able to study the past and look at making some predictions into the future. And those two areas we're going to be looking at are mining and agriculture. Thanks for watching.